Well, first I want to thank Occupy Los Angeles for having me talk. It's great to be here. So, well, first of all, the title of the class is Critical Language in Action, and my name is Christian Chun. I teach at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Southern California. So first I'm going to give you an overview of the class, how the class will be structured, and then I'll give you a quick bio of my expertise, why I'm standing up here and talking about this particular subject. So first, the class is going to be organized into three components. The first one would be kind of giving you an overview of how language forms, or specifically grammar, constructs specific meanings, and how we can use grammar not as a set of rules, but as if we think of grammar not as a set of rules that we learned in high school or elementary school, but grammar really as a resource for making particular meanings, and how we can mobilize those resources to make our own meanings independent of mainstream media and other dominant institutions. So that's the first component. So that's what I'll be addressing for the first 10 minutes or so. And then after about 10 minutes or so, we're going to be breaking up into some groups. I have some handouts for you guys to work in pair group, to look over several exercises, and then we're going to be talking about those language, looking at language in particular. Then we're going to be going over another type of exercise in which we're going to be examining some of the dominant words that we've seen in economic discourses in the past 30 years, such as phrases like the free market, accountability, transparency, and so on, and how that ties into the Occupy movement. And then lastly, the last part of the class will be how we can actually mobilize our own critical language in action in support of social justice and social transformation. Okay? All right, so briefly, just my background. I've been a teacher for the past 20 years. I first started teaching English as a second language here in Los Angeles. Within the past 5 years, I went to get my PhD in educational linguistics, and my focus in my research has been on critical literacy, critical pedagogy, with the aim of transforming classrooms as sites of social transformation. So just to kind of give you an overview in the 10 minutes to kind of frame certain issues of critical language. So first of all, what do we mean by critical literacy? Okay, and critical literacy is distinct from what has been usually presented as critical thinking. So what we usually say is critical thinking is basically kind of more of a humanistic approach in which we examine authors' viewpoints or biases or the logic of their arguments. Critical literacy, in contrast, looks more at the issues of power relations and how society attempts to control or to converge the interpretation of its members. And that is what Raymond Williams has called hegemony, or constructing how this kind of common sense assumptions. So in our society, in particular, in the context of the United States, of course, in the past 30 years, we've seen these notions of how we interpret our economy, how it's framed in the issue of the so-called free market, or how the free market is this almost naturalized way of life or naturalized way of interaction amongst us. That's what I mean by an example of common sense. So when we think of a free market equaling democracy, well, we live in a democracy, so we should be able to be free to engage in so-called free market transactions. Those are kind of this interpretive frame through which we kind of construct common sense notions, and that's what we mean by hegemony. So critical literacy looks at those specific processes, the specific ways that not only mainstream media, but dominant texts, school textbooks, and so forth, help to construct those kind of assumptions. So it's fundamentally a political project. How we all know this, how the media helps to construct these interpretive practices and helps to, or tries to, control our interpretation. That is fundamentally a political project. So what can we do? What is critical literacy attempting to do? Is working with people to see how, as Alan Luke says, the world of texts work to construct our worlds, our identities, our cultures in powerful ideological ways. So one way to think about these things is what Hilary Janks, who is an educator and a longtime anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, has talked about with reading against the text. How can we actually read against the text? Okay, and there's going to be some specific strategies how we can read against the text. This also is in line with the great Brazilian educator and activist Paulo Freire, who I believe a UCLA prof is also teaching a class on his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed here on Tuesdays, I believe. But if you haven't read that, I would highly recommend reading that book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But he and Donato Macedo at the University of Massachusetts have also talked about how it's not only important to read the word, but to read the world in the context of reading that word. Okay. All right, so a couple of things on critical literacy in terms of specific strategies. One would be disrupting the commonplace. How is any text trying to position us as the reader? So when we read text, how does the author or the text speak to us in specific ways? How does it address us? How does it assume our reading positions? How does it try to construct our identities through the textual interaction? Another way to look at text is the idea of multiple viewpoints, interrogating multiple viewpoints. So for example, whose views are represented, whose views are omitted, silenced, and ignored. Okay? And part of this is drawing on this notion of language, as I talked about grammar as a resource for making meaning. So there is the kind of very interesting phrase that's been used to view language as a social semiotic. If we think of language as a social semiotic. Now, social, of course, means on how society helps to construct meanings, why meanings are made in specific social contexts. That's the social part. Semiotics, as many of you have known from your studies from film and arts and so forth, is the act of making signs or making meanings. So putting together, if we view language simply not as a kind of written form on a piece of paper or something that we use in everyday conversation, which of course is important, but as a social semiotic, how we actually use language to oppress, to liberate, to empower, to depress as well. That also is a way to construct our relationships, okay? And these choices are meaningful. The way we use language, these choices are meaningful because they have consequences, of course, material consequences, as we can see in our society, okay? So I'll just give you one quote and then a couple more points before we go into some of this, taking a look at it. But this is, I think, is an interesting quote here, where, again, it's this social semiotic view of language, again, how meanings are made in particular social contexts. But the social semiotic view of language implies it's very difficult to deconstruct the ideological and cultural assumptions that are inherent in any text without also directing our attention to the ways in which those very assumptions are constructed, okay, through grammatical means. We're going to see those in specific examples. So we can ask three questions, basic three questions of every text when we read a text. First of all, what's going on in the text? What part of reality are they trying to represent? Okay. The second one is who is taking part in this interaction? In other words, what is the relationship between the author and the reader? Okay. I'll give you a practical example of what I'm talking about. For some of you, when you write emails, if you write an email to your employer versus writing an email to your friend, the way you write the email is most likely going to be very different. An email to your employer or to a professional colleague, it's probably unlikely you might say, hey, what's up? What's going on? Last night was crazy. No, you would probably construct a different relationship through the language. You would say, dear so-and-so, I was wondering if you could possibly look over the work report I sent you the other day if it's no trouble. Okay, so that's a lot of work right there just to establish that relationship. Okay, versus the email to a friend, which would be much more informal. So that's who's taking part in the interaction. And the third part we can look at the text is what role is language, and now of course other things such as multimedia, the visuals, but in this case primarily what role is language playing in organizing how information is presented and constructed. Okay, so one final point. All right, so okay, actually, let me save that for later. So let's take a look at. So I have some handouts here. So I'd like for you to do is take a few minutes and maybe with someone sitting next to you, take a look at number 1. It says, compare the lead sentences in the following report by the New York Times. All right, and so you have A and B. So take a few minutes, read it over, and then with a partner, if you'd like, kind of discuss what you think maybe, if any, differences between those two texts, between A and B.
Okay, we want to talk?
All right, so yeah, compare notes. You can compare notes for a few minutes with each other, see what you think, and then we can talk about it as groups.
To me, this seems to escalate it in a way that makes it seem like the protesters are the problem.
This one just calls it a showdown and just says it arrested. It doesn't imply anything, and the second one includes the fact that they were on the Brooklyn-bound roadway, which makes it sound more provocative on the protesters' part.
Oh yeah, the B one just looks like the protesters were somewhere where they shouldn't have been.
Right.
Whereas A really shows that the protesters were allowed to go onto the bridge, and then the cops maneuvered, cut them off. So it looks like a setup.
Yeah. Then the other thing it tells me, because I don't trust the New York Times anyway, is that Al Baker is the propagandist for the Times.
Really?
Well, he's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
involved in the first.
Oh, I see what you're
writing
saying,
of it.
yeah.
He did the revision. So
That's
then I would go to
interesting.
the Times and look up Al Baker and see what other articles.
That's a really good point.
And so this group over here, well, let's kind of hear what you guys came up with.
Some of what we were saying is, in the first one, they're identified as protesters, and the word protester, depending on who you are, brings up certain sort of connotations.
Right.
And then the fact that it starts out with the police had allowed them onto the bridge, that it was something they allowed, they were involved with it. And then the cutting off is the language of cutting is kind of violent, and it's with the police in the first one. And in the second one, it seems to, where this seems to put it all on the police more and less on the demonstrators. In the second one, the intent showdown, like as if it was like a equal sort of thing going on.
Right. And that's a great comment. I love all your comments and excellent observations. And that's exactly right. And I would agree with all your assessments in that in terms of the agency, who's accorded agency, who's attributed agency, and the way, I mean, if you look at the specific grammatical construction, right, in the clause, the after allowing them onto the bridge, right, so it's clear, right, and then the police, as you said, cut off and arrested. But in the second, in B here, as you noted, the adjective tense, which already kind of frames it, okay, and as you also noted, that it also seems now there's more of an equal power relations, which was clearly not the case. Notice the grammatical construction. It said, well, and as Melanie said it, as if the police had no other choice because they arrested them after they marched onto the bridge's Brooklyn-bound roadway. So if you don't, just notice how the grammatical construction of those two sentences frame the issues very differently, accords the agency differently, and exactly assigns who is more, perhaps not at fault, but who had no option. Okay, so before we look at the other text, I just want to make another point about grammatical resources. And let me introduce a concept if you're not familiar with it. And another concept with grammar is this idea of what's been called nominalization. And nominalization is basically how we change verbs into nouns. So when we usually think of verbs, we think of, as we were taught back in middle school or high school, verbs are usually action words, things that we do. So things that are doing are also involved in things of process or process verbs, right? I'm walking, or I'm working right now. So these are all process. And as such, I think because of its process, that shows a much more of a dynamic things that are in play. Nominalization takes those dynamic processes and nominalizes it, puts it into a noun or a noun phrase. So, for example, a noun such as, if you remember our history lessons back in 19th century America, the word Reconstruction, right, if we remember that right after the Civil War, Reconstruction itself is a noun, of course, but it is a nominalization because what it has done is it has collapsed a whole series of complex historical series of events and processes into one single noun. Okay, but it doesn't stop there because then it uses, as Czechs use the grammar, it uses it as often as the subject or the causal agent of a sentence. So, for example, Reconstruction led to many changes in the South. Okay, so within that noun hides or collapses a whole range of dynamic processes. Okay, this also has the effect of erasing human agency. Where are the individual human agents who are involved in that? So, for example, the word globalization. Okay, we see globalization in the last 30 years as now a dominant word in our discourse. And this is very interesting. If you go to, Google has that new software where they're examining a whole huge corpus of all these texts. And if you type in the two words, capitalism and globalization, you'll see the frequency of the words used in the English language text. Around 1980, there's a sudden drop-off of the word capitalism in English language text, and with it a corresponding rise of the word globalization. So now globalization is mentioned much more frequently than the word capitalism. So in what ways has globalization replaced the word capitalism? Okay, so this idea of the word globalization as kind of a causal agent in all these processes. So, for example, if we say globalization opens up new markets, okay, who and why is concealed just in that word globalization. So, looking at your handout, if you take a look at, first we'll take a look at number 2. If you take a look at, we could do this together, number 2, we'll do the exercise 2 together. This was from a history text. The Great Depression had left the country with enormous problems. Many people were unemployed, factories closed, and lives and relationships destroyed.
Which caused which?
Exactly. Okay, so which caused which?
Passive voice.
Passive voice, exactly. If we remember back from the grammar lessons in high school, this is the passive voice, which leaves out the agent, right? Which caused which, exactly. And if you notice the noun phrase itself, the Great Depression, okay, left the country with enormous problems. Well, which material agents or which participants are left out in that, right? If we know from history, right? Well, it left the country with enormous problems. Well, what caused the Great Depression? It's not quite clear. Okay, in that sentence, it's almost as if this thing in of itself, without human actors. And notice in the second sentence where they use the be verb were. Now it's kind of almost this adjective form where it's that they're unemployed and the factories are closed. These lives and relationships destroyed. Again, causal agents are not mentioned. It's also almost as if kind of a fact of life or their own characteristic rather than maybe a temporary state of being or a situation. These are working as adjectives to kind of describe these people. All right, let's take a look at number 3, and with your partners, kind of taking a look at this official text from the U.S. Undersecretary of State, Eisenstadt.
Well, yeah, and by saying you, it's like implicating you.
Like, oh, okay, then I better
Like-
not say anything
Right,
more.
exactly,
I
'cause
don't
you're
wanna
simple-
oppose that.
yeah,
because I did it
exactly.
the first place, and then I really don't like the financial crisis. Who did that?
Right. Well, and also we
And we have to
must
kind of
not be
accept it.
afraid. It's as if like you're like a pussy. You know what I mean? Like, it's to shame people out of questioning it.
Right. We just need to accept it. The financial crisis.
Right.
Oh, okay. Fine.
Well, yeah, it's the implication that we know better than
strong
you.
arguments in
So-
favor of it.
so
Like,
Simpson.
why would you even need arguments in favor of it if it's a force of nature? It's almost an afterthought that there are reasons for it. I mean, you've made that they're already understood.
Well, he's
So you need to
addressing,
talk about
he's
it.
singing to the choir. He's addressing an audience to make them feel good and validate what they've already said so that they'll say more of it.
Yeah.
And isn't it also interesting in the second paragraph that the financial crisis has exacerbated fears in developing countries and could fuel a backlash against globalization? Well, in other words, unless you're from some little third world country somewhere that doesn't get it, that you're not going to be against this.
Right.
It's a force of nature, and everybody from a developed country is smart and educated. They get it that it has to be done.
Yeah, it's like parents talking down to children.
Yeah.
Because they already know it's going to happen because we're not involved in it in the 99%. It's already a 1% decision.
It's already setting it up as adversarial, like
Yeah, that's good.
the arguments in support of trade liberalization and open markets are strong ones. They have been made by many of you, and we must not be afraid to engage in those who we respectfully disagree. So it's like you're already on the other side of the table if you've made these strong arguments.
Another word there is the economic liberalization, making it sound like they're liberating people by bringing this globalization in the term liberalizing. I guess assuming that anyone who would be trying to protect their resources or economy from the forces of globalization would be needs to be more liberal and open-minded. And then finally, I was just trying to parse the last sentence. It's kind of a strange construction, I guess. We must not it sounds like they're saying we must not ignore the risks. I think he's talking about the risks of globalization. I mean, if I'm reading it correctly, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, let's take a look at that first paragraph, and I think you mentioned this, right? In the very first sentence, they use the metaphor, he uses, the first two sentences rather, he uses the metaphor of what? Globalization as you said, waves crashing on the shore, right? So it's already this force of nature, right? It's inevitable element, almost like the weather. Well, we go out and, rain is inevitable, right? And so this is kind of very interesting because there's work done by George Lakoff, and actually he was on the telecom a couple of weeks ago when Bob Reich was here. He was on the teleconference, I believe. He's a cognitive linguist at Berkeley, and George Lakoff has talked about the use of metaphors in framing ideological ideas. And so exactly, the framing of globalization as something that is natural and unstoppable, part of nature, equating it to the weather or mountains or so forth, it removes any possibility of our agency to interrupt or to dismantle this type of process. So yes, we cannot stop it anymore. It's impossible to stop. And yes, you're right. When he talks about who is he addressing when it says many of you. Now notice in the third sentence, the arguments in support of trade liberalization, and you did mention the second paragraph, but the arguments in support of trade liberalization in open markets, that's referred back to the first sentence, the nominalization of. So right here we see globalization equals, and he's defining it for us, right? I mean, we know there are millions of meanings of globalization, but here he's trying to, kind of define it on his own terms here. It's open markets. Okay. What other things did you notice?
It's very Old Testament.
Yeah.
In a certain way.
Totally.
It's got a religious tone to it.
Yeah.
And brings up emotions rather than ideas.
I was thinking that, and I was trying to find a way to pull it out of that as opposed to just an essence. but with the inevitability and the waves crashing on the shore, I felt like it had a deification about it.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? As if it's a force greater
Right.
than a collective decision.
Right.
It's so, you know,
Right.
this has been a given to us.
Given to us. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Right.
I like that.
Yeah, it's
Right.
to form and not inform.
Right. Right.
Opinion.
Right. Okay. Yes, great. And then notice again in this idea. Oh, okay. And then so which is also interesting. If you notice when there seemed to be a contradiction already in the text, right? Where in that first sentence where it's inevitable, we can't stop it anymore. But then in that last sentence, as you were just talking about, we must not be afraid to engage those with whom we respectfully disagree. Well, implying that if people in fact contesting globalization, then how can it be inevitable? Okay, so there he kind of almost inadvertently kind of exposes the contradiction there. To the last point you were, right? Yeah.
It's the last sentence.
The last sentence. How do we kind of deconstruct this last sentence? Or the last phrase, nor should we ignore its undeniable risks. How might we interpret this?
Those words are fear-based words. So he starts out by saying, yes, I'm going to validate everything you believe. You're on God's side, because we've got that whole deification aspect here. The people in the second paragraph, the people who disagree with us only disagree because, in essence, they're inferior to us.
Right.
And then in the third case, but we need to fear them. We're right, they're wrong, we need to fear them, so that means you must act.
Right.
To me, that's what the whole thing says.
Great.
Even just referring to the dialogue as the world,
Right.
because it's sort of like I'm gonna bring you into my camp.
It's very
as-
presumptuous.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
world?
Yeah, exactly.
The world?
Exactly.
You're going to tell the world?
Yeah, right,
then
exactly.
Then he's shooting down the number one easy to apply tool against globalization, which is tariffs.
Right. Right.
That's the usual
Right.
protectionist thing that's in play.
Right. Right. And notice the adjective, of course, fruitless.
Fruitless. Oh, yeah,
Fruitless.
totally.
Right. There's no point in resisting it. Okay. All right. Good. Any other comments? Observations?
Well,
Yeah.
just back to what you were saying previously about taking a noun and turning it into, taking a verb and turning it into a noun. There's no indication of what is doing this globalization and what is the globalization that's happening, and then who's affected by it or what's going on.
Exactly. Exactly.
Really good point about the neutrality of financial crisis. It absolves them of any responsibility
Yeah.
for anything
Who's
being
responsible
troubled.
Right,
for that?
right.
Well, those that are globalizing
Exactly.
caused that financial crisis.
Exactly. Okay, great. So now I'd like to get into the second part, which is to take a look at number 4. And there are 5 phrases. So I guess in your same kind of groups. So maybe in your group you could do the market. This group can do accountability. This group you can do flexibility. If you want to talk about transparency. Okay, so take a few minutes and kind of look over these phrases and what you might make of them, or how you would define it, or how it's been defined for us.
Professor Chung,
Yeah. No.
we need clarification.
Okay.
What do you
So
want
first
us
of all,
to do with
define
that
it.
word?
What do you think it means? And then how has it been used? Can you think of an example of how it's been used? Okay. And then what are the implications of those usages?
That it was just like it's something that we don't necessarily have control over. It's just something. It's like a flowing river, and you know we just kind of have to go along with it because it's like it's a force of nature. Again, that's a big thing economists often use when they do the market, and when they fight against things like regulations, because it's like, well, it's a force of nature. You can't stop it. You're just
So when they use that for anybody, it's like it's a way to focus blame on a particular group and take the accountability off anybody else.
It's really tempting to try to be the person who set the terms of any conversation that you could be having a discussion with somebody else. How one one person tends to try to set the terms of the language or the arguments in a way that sort of puts them in the driver's seat.
So if you're the flexible one, you lost.
All right, so I guess starting with this group, what did you guys? How did you kind of
Seeking
process
accountability.
the phrase? the
And that's
word
what when
market?
people keep saying like they don't have a goal. It's like, actually, I think they
Again,
do.
it's
just that they're trying to get
it's a
people to
verb
be
that's
accountable
turned into a noun.
and to do something about it.
The market is somewhere where things are exchanged, where exchanges
They can
happen.
put everything.
But here, it's an entity of itself.
Yeah, exactly. How many times have we seen it as the active subject of a sentence, right? The market dictates this, or,
Right.
Because of the market, right? It's a very interesting point. The radical economist Richard Wolff has, he's taught economics at the University of Massachusetts for many years, and now he's back in New York. But for those of you who took economics courses in high school or maybe in college, but the market is always presented as this idea of supply and demand, as it's taught traditionally.
Right.
But the market itself is not supply and demand, because if that were the case, it would look very different, because obviously we have people's demands for a lot of goods and services that aren't being met. So,
That's what I was.
but in fact, the market is actually not supply and demand, but what things are actually going to be paid for. Just an example, I was just looking at this catalog the other day of Neiman Marcus, and they are selling Ferraris for the Neiman Marcus crowd at $400,000, and they've made only 10 of them. Okay, so clearly it is not this question of supply and demand.
Yeah.
It is what the people are going to be. So yeah, I mean, it's also interesting how the market is also, as you said, it's also presented as something that we have almost no control over. Okay, did you guys do accountability? Yep.
No, I'm just saying omnipotent.
Yes, yes, like organization. Okay, so how did you unpack accountability?
Who wants to start?
Go ahead.
Okay, I look at it like the people in the financial institutions, by assigning their own narrow definition to that word, have now skewed their view and their vision for the use of that word in all respects. And put as briefly as possible, it used to be that if you were engaged in any enterprise, your number one duty and responsibility was to make sure that that enterprise would have longevity. Because if it wasn't there tomorrow, it wasn't employing people, it wasn't paying for your retirement, it wasn't able to do anything to meet market needs, to manufacture things. Today, somewhere along the line, all that's been lost. Today, accountability means I'm accountable to my board of directors and my stockholders. I must make sure that we're paying stock dividends and that the board of directors can collect big fat bonuses. Doesn't make any difference if the enterprise has any longevity. It can fail tomorrow and you can grab your bailout package and be gone. We've seen it in industry after industry across the board. So that simplifies their whole definition and sense of accountability to where it comes down to in the classroom. Teacher accountability simply means there's a standardized test, your students have to do well with it, or you're no good as a teacher. Doesn't make any difference if the kids can function in society, communicate, get a job, contribute in any way to the future of society. Oh no, everything is pared down to these very narrow, specific definitions.
Right. Yeah. Great illustration. Great. Okay. Great. Anybody want to add to that? Or? Okay.
For me, accountability in the common usage seems more big after people have been caught doing things. Then they're more concerned about accountability than prior to.
Right.
Especially in high finance.
Right.
And just to account, his business has an accountant, because you have to have the ins and outs, but it's changed from a financial thing to a behavioral thing. You have to account for the ins and outs of the behaviors instead of the books.
Right.
It's sort of like taking their responsibility and putting it somewhere else. Like, oh, it's the poor people who are doing it. They're not contributing. They're not doing anything.
Right.
Because they're poor. Like, nothing.
It seems also like it's a device for self-policing. If you're worried about the threat of accountability, it's going to affect your behavior, as a teacher or as a citizen. You know what I mean? So basically, you end up doing the policing yourself, and you're like unpaid labor.
Yeah, great point. And that's exactly what Michel Foucault has talked about in his notion of biopolitics and the whole neoliberal culture in the past 30 years of how we've become this kind of exactly policing ourselves or holding ourselves accountable within the system. Yeah, great point. Yeah. Okay. What was the next one? Flexibility? Yeah, flexibility. Yeah.
You know, again, when people set terms, and if somebody says you need to be more flexible, it's basically one person entrenching their position and dictating how somebody else has to step off their position as a way of poking holes and destabilizing or delegitimizing somebody else's argument.
Right.
And it also feels like sometimes flexibility is actually code word for malleability.
And wishy-washy. Maybe you don't have a strong viewpoint one way or another, or a strong position, so you're too flexible. Sounds to me, I mean, personally, I think it's great. Flexibility, good, but it could be construed as bad.
How is it used in the workplace? Yeah.
No, it's basically used to destroy, you know, the worker protections we have, like, you know, having a designated lunchtime, or having to work an 8-hour day. You know, you bash workers by saying you need flexibility. We need flexibility. We need you to, you know, put in more time, and you know, that kind of thing. Where you need to be flexible. That's how it's used. It's basically saying you're rigid and uptight if you think that you deserve a 15-minute break, and you're not with the modern way that we're doing stuff, which, you know, it's like double speak. I mean, they're as usual, they're, you know, co-opting a nice sounding word to mean something that's used to destroy the rights of working people.
Right.
Yeah, fosters capitulation.
Right. Yeah, great point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, a word that before, exactly, when we say, well, let's be flexible, let's be kind of compromising, now is taken on this specific meaning in the workplace, where, right, we need, so the so-called flexible economy, or the company needs to be flexible in the knowledge-based economy.
Right, so they can lay off 10,000 people because they need to be flexible, because they need that capital for their hedge fund.
Right. Okay. Right.
I'd feel guilty if I wasn't being flexible.
Exactly. You made to feel guilty or something else. Okay, great. Transparency, sir? Transparency?
Great word for reducing fears of, you know, corruption, cheating, hidden agendas, whatever, to a degree, you know, by using that word. But to what degree are they really being transparent? You know, you have to then, you know, you're still fearful of that. So, but it's a quick way to push aside some fears anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I would say, again, going back to the workplace, asking the workers to be transparent without the board of directors having to be transparent and so forth. So, okay, great. So the last part is the last number 5, and this is kind of like how we can mobilize critical language and action in the service of Occupy movement and social justice. So maybe with your group, if you a few minutes, if you could come up in one sentence, if you know, you had the classic, you know, reporter, whatever, mainstream reporter sticking a microphone in your face, and you know that person's only going to give you 10 seconds, whatever, you know, so-called soundbite. In one sentence, would you be able, or how would you be able to describe or characterize the Occupy movement?
Yeah, well, I was going to say you know, it's American citizens, but it's not just American citizens. And I find, like, personally, like, I like the 99% as a way for people to
There's been no
have a
effort
sense of
to
unity. And I don't like when things I was going to say,
What do you have here?
It is the movement. It is an expression of frustration that society isn't working very well, and an appeal for solutions.
The people demand and want to reclaim. No, see, the people want to reclaim a voice in the face of corporate takeover.
The people.
The
All right,
people.
So the people want to reclaim voice and corporate. Okay. All right.
Our goal is to redistribute all of the wealth to all of the people.
Our goal is to redistribute all of the wealth to all of the people. All right.
Go youth! Go youth!
We have two. We have one that we would like to steal from the LA City Council's resolution in support of us, and then one we made on our own. Do you want to read that one first?
Yeah, this one's actually really good. The Occupy demonstrations are a rapidly growing movement with the shared goal of urging U.S. citizens to peacefully assemble and occupy public space in order to create a shared dialogue by which to address the problems and generate solutions for economically distressed Americans.
So that came from our council.
Yeah.
And then from our occupiers, a global movement of diverse and concerned citizens coming together to redress their economic and social grievances.
Great.
And we won't go away.
We will go away.
Great.
We're a force of nature.
Yeah.
It's futile to,
The occupation is a force of nature. Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting, yeah. Recently Cornel West has characterized the Occupy movement as what he called a love movement. So it's kind of interesting how he's focusing on this particular word, love. And others have tried to characterize it as a pro-democracy movement, which is kind of interesting. So, I mean, I think it's important for us to continue to kind of explore ways in which, drawing on George Lakoff's work, which we talked about, how the use of framing or particular metaphors, how we can contest and combat the dominant discourses that we've seen. But I want to thank you all for coming, and this is hopefully just the start of many more conversations to come. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Yeah, let's get it right there.